Well, I want to talk about when your spouse won't have sex with you. And I want to begin by saying marriage is a covenant. Now, the word covenant means to cut. God cut Adam when he created marriage and created Eve. So the word covenant means a sacrificial, permanent relationship. That when God creates a relationship, it's a covenant. Jesus said, "This is the new covenant in my blood." Okay. And every time God creates a covenant, there's a covenant seal and a covenant sign. The example of that is the new covenant, salvation that we have with Jesus. The covenant seal is water baptism. The covenant sign is communion. In other words, seal means seal the deal. Jesus said, "He who believes and is baptized will be saved." So in other words, you believe and you seal it through water baptism. Okay. The communion. Every time you take communion, it means, "Lord, I remember." This is a sign of good faith. Well, why am I saying all this? Because sex is the covenant seal and sign of marriage. When you get married, you consummate your marriage by having sex. See, we've trivialized sex in our society, and we've decontextualized sex from marriage. But sex only has a context in marriage biblically, the way God sees it. Look at all the problems we're having today because we have decontextualized it. So when we get married, sex seals the covenant of our marriage. But it's also a covenant sign, which means when we're having sex, what I'm saying is, I remember the commitment that I made to you. In other words, I'm not having sex with you just because I feel good right now, or even because I feel sexual right now. I'm having sex because I committed to love and cherish you until death separated us. This is not a relationship of convenience. This is a sacrificial, permanent relationship, and I am going to bear the covenant sign before you as I promised that I would. So when a spouse says, or just will not have sex with another person, it's devastating. And now there's some marriages where, both spouses agree and they just don't have sex. Okay, so you can have a good marriage, especially as you age, you can have a good marriage without having sex. But, when one person wants sex and the other person will not give them sex, it's devastating to the relationship. And my encouragement, if you have a spouse that, isn't giving you sex, you need to get counseling. I would immediately get counseling and get your spouse to get counseling. Now, your spouse may say, "Well, I don't feel well physically." Well, God made our bodies to where we can have orgasms without having intercourse. So even if a man has, erectile dysfunction, or a woman has some kind of vaginal dryness or problems or something like that, there are many ways to be sexual without having intercourse. And so, the Christopher Reeve, who is Superman, who broke his neck and became a quadriplegic, he had sex with his wife. They talked about it on national television, about they still had a sexual relationship and he was paralyzed from the neck down. And what it meant was he had an attitude of serving his wife and being sexual to her, even in his condition. I'm just saying, if he could have sex, anybody can have sex. It's a matter of your attitude. So if your spouse just simply says, "I won't have sex with you," you need to get counseling. If they have medical problems, they need to get help. But even if they're not able to completely resolve their medical problems, you can still please your spouse, even if you can't be sexual. It's just a matter of your attitude. It's a matter if you're going to bear the covenant that you said that you would bear. And see, most people don't know that sex is the covenant seal and sign of marriage. But I'm saying this, when you're having sex regularly in marriage, it improves the marriage. And it says something to your spouse. It says, "I'm attracted to you." It says, "I desire you." That I'm going to serve you. When you're not having sex with your spouse, you're saying one of these things: "I'm angry. I'm going to punish you. I'm not attracted to you. I don't feel like it. This is a relationship of convenience, and I'm not going to do anything that I don't feel like. I've got some medical problems, and you're not important enough for me to address it. Or I've got medical problems I can't resolve, and I'm not going to be creative just to please you. You're not that important to me." Any way you slice it, it's devastating. Okay, it's devastating. So you need to get help. You need to get counseling. Go outside of your marriage, even if your spouse won't. You need to get help. Ultimately, if you're in a marriage, I had a man that I counseled, and he was in his early 40s, very healthy man, loved his wife, and his wife came up to him and she said, I'm not having sex with you again, don't ask. And he came to me and said, what do I do? And I said, get help now. You get help right now. And I want to say this now. Again, it is the covenant, it's the basis of your covenant. Sex is the basis of your covenant. Okay? And when you have a person that says, I'm out, I check out, I'm not having sex with you, I would separate. If they will not resolve the issue, I would separate from them. And you find a place, or they find a place, and you say, well, you've basically ended our marriage. All we have now is a financial relationship or a relationship around the kids or whatever. So if you're refusing to have sex with me and you will not resolve the issue on some level, I'm going to separate. I'm not divorcing you, but I'm separating. What I'm saying is, I'm not going to give you the benefits of washing your clothes and, taking care of you or whatever, if you're not going to give me the benefit of sex, because it is the essence of our relationship. If you're checking out on me, I'm not going to act like there's not a problem, and I'm not going to sentence myself to a sexless future because you won't have sex. Okay? Separate, pray, be accountable to someone, a spiritual leader or someone. Don't just do all this on your own. And take a period of time. Don't just do this in a few weeks. Wait, a year or whatever. And I know that sounds like a long time, but you need to wait on God. And you need to be healthy before you go on with your life. But ultimately, if a person refuses to have sex with you, it is a basis of separation and ultimately divorce. It's not what you want. You want to resolve this without that. But it's devastating. It's devastating to the essence of the marriage. And so that's my encouragement to you if you're in a sexless marriage.
There's no drama, no fighting. You're married, you've been together for years, and maybe you've even raised children together. The love is still there, but the spark just isn't. As months drift into years, you realize you're in a sexless marriage. How's it going, YouTube? My name is Brad Browning, and I'm a relationship coach and marriage expert. And today I'm going to talk to you about how to revive sex and intimacy so that you and your spouse can finally eject some passion back into your marriage. Believe it or not, it's common for the frequency of lovemaking to wane over time, and there can be many reasons for this. Maybe the novelty is worn off, or you and your spouse are busy with jobs, children, and social lives, leaving you little time and energy for intimacy. Perhaps you're not in the mood because you have a poor body image of yourself, or you're experiencing other difficulties in your relationship. Or your sex life may be dwindling due to physiological factors, chronic illness, medication, depression, or addictions. The possibilities really are endless. But regardless of the reason, it's important to understand that getting intimacy back into your relationship is important because it's very rare to have a healthy marriage without it. That said, sex can be a complicated thing. It's beautiful, it's fun, it's special, and it feels good, but it's also tied up with self-esteem, emotions, intimacy, health, and personal history. You could think of it as a simple act, but in reality, it could be the sole source of tension in your relationship. Unless both partners have a very low sex drive, a lack of passion, sex, and intimacy can be a downfall for a marriage. And unfortunately, it's also quite easy to fall into a vicious cycle when it comes to sex. It's hard to want to have it when you feel emotionally detached, but it's hard to feel emotionally bonded without physical intimacy. Basically, the less happy you are, the less sex you want, and the less sex you have, the less happy you are in your relationship. But don't panic. As much as it may feel impossible to get the passion back into your relationship right now, it is possible, I promise, and I know how to help you make that happen. Now, it is important for you to know that it's not unusual for one person in a couple to have a greater desire for sex than the other. And there can be a lot of reasons for this, a major one of which is testosterone. Generally associated with men, testosterone drives sexual desire, which is why the assumption that men are more interested in sex than women is such an age-old belief. But that said, women's sexual desire can also be linked to fluctuating testosterone levels, and as both men and women age, their testosterone levels change, which changes their interest in intimacy along with it. Now, that is not to say that men and women have the same needs when it comes to sex. For instance, women tend to need an emotional bond before they're interested in having sex. They need their husbands to be attentive, thoughtful, and loving. They want to share their emotions and spend time together. If their partner's been distant, disinterested, or absent, the last thing a woman will want to do is make love. But on the other hand, if a man has been complaining or criticizing his wife for not wanting sex more often, the wife will likely feel turned off and any shred of passion is going to be lost. So men, if you want to have a more fulfilling sexual relationship, you need to give your wife what she needs. Listen to her, show interest in her, do small, thoughtful things, and spend time together. Remember, being absent from her life is a turn-off, and taking her on a date is a turn-on. Unlike women, men usually don't need as much emotional bonding to desire sex. And again, sometimes that has a lot to do with the fact that they have more testosterone. But this means that they think about and desire sex more often and require a lot less bonding and emotional closeness before having sex. In fact, men tend to be just as the opposite of women. The more sexual relations the couple have, the better the husband feels about his wife and their marriage. And since men's confidence is generally linked to being a good provider, by satisfying their wives sexually, they get their emotional bonding needs met by having sex. And oftentimes, men simply can't understand why their wives don't think about it and want sex as much as they do. So ladies, if you're even a tiny bit interested in having sex, go ahead and do it. The intimate bond that you want with your husband will follow, and you'll both be more interested in sexual intimacy in the future. As you and your spouse identify different problem areas in your relationship and work through them, you'll both likely start to become more comfortable with being physical and intimate with one another again. Give it time and be willing to move slowly. One common technique used for couples struggling with sexual intimacy is to hold off on intercourse and learn to appreciate and enjoy the other kinds of connecting first. So if your relationship begins to improve and you find that your sex life is still lagging far behind, don't be afraid to consult a sex therapist or a physician. And alternatively, you can also go to my website and watch the free video presentation on there. In that video, I reveal even more techniques on how you can revive that spark that you and your spouse shared when you first met. Just go to www.marriageguy.com to watch that free video presentation. That's marriageguy.com. So let's first talk about the initial steps that need to be taken if you're looking to rediscover your intimacy. First off, you need to be realistic. If you're looking for the incredibly magical and passionate sex that you and your partner shared on your honeymoon, then that's probably being a bit unrealistic. It's one thing to revive the sex and intimacy in your marriage, but it's another thing to reignite the butterflies that you and your partner shared when you were only just first getting to know each other. But that said, just because the honeymoon phase is over, it doesn't mean that you can't explore an entire new stage in your relationship. One of the most important things you can do to reach this new stage is to communicate with your spouse. So let's talk about that next step, the talk. Many couples fail to talk about sex because they get embarrassed and instead say nothing and hope that things are going to magically change. It's important to be open and honest with your spouse and face the fact that beating around the bush won't help change anything. Instead, try saying something along the lines of, "I'd like to spice up our sex life. We've fallen into some bad habits." Or you could say, "We need to have sex, the same as we do other things that are important to us. I think we should set aside time for it." The first step to bridging the gap with your spouse is by making time for each other outside the bedroom. Your relationship should be a priority for both of you. Set aside time together at least 3 times a week. This can include a date night, cuddle time, sharing a hobby, whatever it is. If you're already doing these things, then try something new. Take a cooking class together, try a new sport, sign up for a sex workshop even. The easiest way to reconnect is to find new interests together. So trying something new requires a lot of focus, and believe it or not, that's good for your sex life. Create your own rituals to share together. A couple ritual is a habit that you and your spouse share that's unique to your relationship. It can be as simple as brushing your teeth together, kissing before you leave for work, an inside joke, or a competition to answer game show questions. Whatever you decide on, make it something that you both enjoy and then keep the ritual going for years to come. Take a second to think back to the beginning of your relationship when you were first falling for your spouse. Remember the way that they would make you laugh or tease you? Reviving that type of playful flirting is one of the easiest ways to reactivate your sex life. While dating, couples are great at flirting with one another. They share sexy text messages, speak in innuendos, smile and toss their hair, dress their best, and in general, they try to be attractive to their partner. Flirting is a key component to getting that sexual spark back into your marriage. As humans, we respond to physical connection. So a good place to start when it comes to reviving intimacy is by significantly increasing touching. By doing this, you'll definitely increase your intimacy and your intimate connection with your spouse. Don't know where to start? Begin by just touching your spouse's arm fleetingly when you pass in the hall, or holding hands when you take a stroll. Kiss each other good night, good morning, and when you see each other after work. Sit close while watching TV, and always have at least one body part touching when you go to bed. When you do get between the sheets, keep things spontaneous and fun. Allow each other plenty of sensual time to get warmed up. Unlike when you were in your 20s when sex was straightforward, desire, arousal, orgasm, when you're over 40, foreplay becomes much more important to build arousal and desire. Don't be shy to ask your partner what they like or want. Even if you've been sleeping with your spouse for a decade, as you age, your mindset changes. So think of it this way. Early marital sex is essentially sex with a stranger. It's about letting your partner know you and getting to know them intimately. Marital sex, though, on the other hand, can be even more gratifying if you can develop an intimate sexual style with your marriage partner, something that's completely yours and unique to you as a couple. No matter where you are in your quest to revive the sex in your marriage, understand that intimacy in long-term relationships, and especially in marriages, takes work from both parties. As long as you're both committed to doing that work, you'll be just fine. And if you have any questions about reviving your sex life, or you'd like more advice on bringing intimacy back to your marriage, you can learn a little more about my one-on-one marriage coaching at marriageguy.com/coaching. That's marriageguy.com/coaching. And I also talk about this topic a bit more in the free video on my website, marriageguy.com. So that's also worth checking out once this video is over. Speaking of which, that is it for now. Thank you so much for watching my video. Hopefully you learned something new. As always, I appreciate those of you who take the time to like my videos and subscribe to my channel, and also on my social media platforms. You can follow me on there. I really appreciate your support. I'm also interested in hearing your feedback, so go ahead and leave me a message below with your questions or comments. And that's about it for now. So take care, and we'll see you next time.
All over the United States and all over the world, relationships are going through their ups and downs right now. The Oxygen 365 podcast brings you some of the best relationship advice, thinking, and practical ideas available. Advice you can act on this moment, or tonight, tomorrow, or when you need it the most. Our collection of interviews with some of the top authors, speakers, and leaders in all aspects of relationships can help you grow, get through a trouble spot, or make an already good day great. Get ready to join our host, Noel Metter, as he interviews our guests each week, bringing you the best and most current information on improving your relationships. Whether you're dating, engaged, newly married, empty nesters, or in the thick of a problem, you're sure to gain something from our interview today. So without further delay, here's Noel with today's guest and a ton of solid, practical relationship advice.
Welcome to Oxygen 365. I'm your host, Noel Metter, and today's podcast, I have the privilege of interviewing a very special guest, Michelle Weiner Davis. She's the author of Divorce Remedy, The Sex-Starved Wife, and Divorce Busting. She's a regular guest on Oprah, 48 Hours, 2020, and Today Show. She's an international renowned seminar leader and marriage therapist in private practice. Michelle offers telephone coaching to help you save your marriage and get your sex life back on track. Michelle, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me. But Noel, I have to tell you, you forgot the most important title in your description, and that's The Sex-Starved Marriage.
You beat me to the punch. I was just going to say, and today we're going to be discussing her book, The Sex-Starved Marriage, Practical Steps to Boosting Your Marriage Libido. So you're absolutely right, and I'm really excited about what we're going to be covering today, because I got to ask you, is this a really big problem? I mean, I know that you've been doing this for a long, long time, and I know you've written books on it, but give our listeners just an idea how big a problem this is.
So I've been specializing in working with couples who have marital problems for the last 3 decades. And what I found in my practice, and also the research tells us, that approximately 1 in every 3 couples is experiencing a sexual desire gap. And I'll explain more about that in just a minute. So I want your listeners and viewers to really understand that if they're struggling in their sexual relationship and they're arguing about sex because one person's hot and the other one isn't, that they're not alone. There should be some comfort in knowing that.
Because I think that actually is related to that question I just asked, was how do you actually define you're in a sex-starved marriage? I mean, is that like the number of times that you make love through the week, a month? I mean, how do you actually diagnose this?
Well, I always say having a healthy sexual relationship isn't like having a daily minimum requirement like a vitamin. It really is different for all couples, but I can give you a definition, Noel, of a sex-starved marriage. And a sex-starved marriage is one where one spouse is desperately longing for more touch, more physical closeness, more sex, more physical connection, and the other spouse thinks, what is the big deal? Would you just get a life? It's just sex. But to the spouse yearning for more touch, it's a huge deal because it really is about feeling wanted, about feeling loved, about feeling appreciated, about feeling close emotionally. And when this major disconnect happens, what also happens is that intimacy on all levels goes right out the door. Mm-hmm. They stop sitting next to each other on the couch. They stop laughing at each other's jokes. They stop doing things together. In essence, they really stop being friends. Mm-hmm. And it places the marriage at risk of infidelity and divorce. But being the divorce buster, as that's how people know me, I can tell people that if they have been arguing about sex, that it doesn't nail the marital coffin shut, that there are so many things that couples can do to bridge the sexual desire gap and to really bring back the passion.
Yeah, and I want to get into that. Before we do that, though, I need to ask the question, what, as you see it, and I know that you work with a lot of couples around this very, very sensitive topic, what are these steps, these tragic steps that lead them to the unfortunate conclusion of being in a sex-starved marriage?
Well, one of the typical things that happens in relationships, and by the way, I have to say a couple things more about the sex-starved marriage. Okay. One is that most people don't talk about it, but it's a pretty self-evident fact that the person with lower sexual desire controls the sexual relationship. And they don't do it because they're mean-spirited or they're controlling or they're manipulative. They do it because if they're not in the mood, sex isn't likely to happen. And Noel, I find this to be somewhat interesting because when you think about how decisions are made in marriage, you usually think about mutual decisions. Two people together decide whether to get married, whether to have kids, how to deal with finances and the in-laws and where they're going to spend holidays. But conspicuously missing from the mix is anything at all having to do with the sexual relationship. And there's something else interesting about that. The person with lower sexual desire actually expects his or her spouse to accept the decision, not to complain about it, and also, oh yes, by the way, you must be monogamous. And this tacit agreement doesn't work all that well. So what typically happens, and more specifically in answer to your question, one person in the relationship, usually the less sexual one, really needs to feel close and connected on an emotional level before they're interested in being sexual. And then you have the other spouse who really needs to feel close and connected on a sexual level before they're interested in investing in the relationship. And what typically happens is both spouses wait for the other person to change. And I'm telling you, it's a deadly waiting game because they grow further and further apart.
Yeah.
The other thing that also happens, and you talk about the steps of getting to this distance, is generally the person with lower desire has very little empathy for the person with higher desire, because usually people with lower desire think to themselves, well, really, it is just about scratching an itch. It's not anything, really big or important. But to the spouse yearning for more touch, as I said before, it's much, much bigger than that. It really is about feeling close and connected. And if you'd like, I'd tell you a story about a couple that I worked with.
I would love it.
Okay, this really illustrates this, and I think so many people resonate with this story because it is so typical. I was working with a couple that had been married for about 15 years, and they had a pretty good relationship, but they were in therapy to kind of iron out some of their garden variety issues. And the guy was a very laid-back guy, but toward the end of the session, he actually had a complaint for the very first time. And he said, Michelle, there really is only a 2-hour window of opportunity on Fridays between 10 and 12 where my wife might be interested in sex. And when he said that, I glanced over at her, and she was sort of smiling because she recognized herself in that description. But when I glanced back at him, he was not smiling at all. And so I asked him, tell me what this has been like for you. And he sort of took a deep breath, and he turned to her, and he said, when we're in bed together and I reach out to you and you're not there for me, all I can think about is, are you still attracted to me the way I'm attracted to you? Do you love me anymore? Do you even want to be in this marriage? And then when you go to sleep and I'm staring up at the ceiling and hearing you breathing next to me, all I can tell you is that it's the loneliest feeling in the world, lying next to you in bed. Wow. And to this woman's credit, I have to tell you, her eyes filled up with tears, and she reached out and she grabbed for his hand, and here's what she said. Do you know that every time you touch me, the only thing I ever think about is, am I in the mood? Am I not in the mood? I never, not once, have thought about what it's like to be you. And I am so, so sorry. And I promise I will try harder. And he began to cry. And between me and you and everyone who's listening, I began to cry. It was an incredibly touching moment. Wow. And I just want to say one more thing about that. You know, when people are listening to this story, I don't want them to get the impression that it's always the man who has higher desire, because I'm here to tell you that I think low desire in men is America's best kept secret. So it can go either way. It really isn't just about women having headaches. Men can get headaches too.
Yeah. You know, you're right. And I was going to ask that question. Is this a gender thing, right? And you're saying, no, actually it goes both ways. Let me ask this question. What do you think are contributing factors to why men are more or less becoming the low desire side of the equation?
Well, for one thing, I think it is more typical to hear about men having high desire and women having low desire. Right. I think that there have been lots of reasons that men have low desire. For one thing, you know, with the economy having been what it's been, so many businesses have downsized. Many men have either lost their jobs or their jobs have changed. And a man's self-esteem is very connected to their sense of achievement at work. And when that isn't working out so well, a lot of men feel really deflated and they're not feeling sexual. That's one thing. Yeah. Sometimes it is hormonal issues. Sometimes they need testosterone supplementation. But one of the biggest reasons that I see men being less interested in sex than we think that they often are is that very often their wives who are upset about the fact that they're not connecting physically become very, very critical. And criticism is not exactly an aphrodisiac. So most men really, and actually it's true both ways, most people who feel criticized and feel their spouse's anger steer clear of being physical with their spouses.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I want to come back to the low desire person. And you said that really sets the pace oftentimes in the relationship. What advice do you have for the low desire person in the relationship, if that be the case?
That's a great question, Noel. So first of all, I think that it's really important to develop a little empathy. And I hope that they heard the story that I just told about that other couple. That's number one. Number two, you know, with what we now know about how to boost sexual desire, whether there are physical causes, personal issues, or interpersonal issues, there is such great help out there that it really is imperative that people seek the help that's available. That's the second thing. Third thing, and this may sound funny, but it's really, really important, that they adopt the Nike philosophy and just do it. And let me tell you why. I wish that I had $1 for each time someone in my practice, often a woman, said to me, you know, Michelle, I really wasn't in the mood when my husband reached out to me and started being sexual. I had a lot on my mind. I just really wasn't present. But once we got into it, I really enjoyed myself. I had an orgasm. It felt great. And then I noticed that afterwards, we were much closer. I actually, once I described this to a couple in my practice, I actually had a man recently say to me, that's my wife. I wish she would just write on her hand, I like sex, so she remembers it for the next time. And Noel, this happened so many times that I started to do a little research about this. And what I found out is that for millions of people, and many of them are women, sexual desire, what has to happen is they have to get their feet moving in order to feel sexual desire. They have to be physically aroused before their brains realize that they're into it and they enjoy it. So that's why I think it really behooves especially women to be approachable when their husbands initiate sex. If they're feeling even neutral, they should begin and watch the fact that they are actually going to enjoy it, and it's going to have such incredible relationship benefits. And there's one more tip that I have for the person with lower desire. Very often when they're not in the mood, nothing happens. And what's to say that that person can't offer their partner a gift? In other words, to pleasure their spouse. Even if they're not in the mood and they're just really not into it, there's something to be said for giving their spouse a gift. And so often when I say that, believe it or not, the low desire spouse says, yeah, I'm willing to do that, but my partner isn't willing to do that. And then I turn to the partner and the partner says, yeah, some of my enjoyment, a big part of my enjoyment comes from watching my spouse get off on this, really be excited. Yeah. And if he or she's not excited, I don't want to do it. And you know what my advice is to that person? Get over it. Yeah. Accept a gift. You're not clones. You're not going to have be in the mood exactly at the same time. So being able to be more flexible in this area really, I think, helps a lot.
That's huge. That's so important. I think it's interesting that they do set the pace in the relationship, which is frustrating for the high desire individual. And I guess I kind of want to jump to that, because if they are setting the pace, the low desire is setting the pace, the high desire, what would you say to them as it relates to that frustration, even maybe bitterness, anger around the situation of, gosh, you know what? My needs aren't being met in this. So
that, you're mind reading, because that's where I was headed next. So thank you for that question. I appreciate it. So here's what happens in these relationships. Initially, the person with higher desire is, I think, quite open and expresses his or her feelings with vulnerability. I say use the F word, meaning talk about your feelings, okay? And so they'll say things openly like, I'm missing you. I'm feeling disconnected from you. This is so important to me. Sex is how I really feel close to you. But when those needs aren't met, and they often aren't because the person with lower desire really isn't getting how important this is in the relationship, the vulnerability quickly shifts into anger. And then the person is not only angry about the fact that they're not having sex, the anger spills over to every other aspect of their life together. They're yelling about the wet towels left on the floor or the pop can left in the den. And it's all a smokescreen for the fact that this dynamic is going on. And so one of the things that I tell people with higher desire is that while I completely understand how angry and frustrated you are, again, that is not an aphrodisiac. That only pushes your partner further and further away. So here's what you have to do. You have to go back to square one and express your feelings from your heart. You're much more likely to get a spouse to try to be empathetic and understanding if you're speaking from a place of vulnerability rather than from anger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I have to think, we're talking about long-term committed relationships that when this dynamic starts to play in the relationship, is that where you see the unfortunate reality of kind of the blow up and moving towards separation? And here's my question. Is this unavoidable? I feel like there's two forces at work here that are really playing against themselves. You have the one side of it is routine, predictability. There's that sense of dependability, security, right? Which we all want in a long-term relationship.
Right.
But at the other side of the equation, you have novelty, adventure, spontaneity, and it feels like these forces are working against themselves in the relationship. And how do you, what advice would you give to couples who are kind of stuck in that polarity in their relationship?
Well, one thing I want to say, as being someone in a very long-term marriage myself, that like anything else in life, whether it's sexuality or communication or parenting, in order to really be good at this and to have it sustain itself over time, you have to make it a priority. And I know that's sort of standard advice, but when I oftentimes give that advice to couples, they'll say, well, there's the kids and it's their soccer schedule, or we don't have time. And I say, like anything else, you have to actually plan time to be passionate, to be sexual. You have to, and then they say, well, it's not spontaneous. I'll say, well, then you have to have planned spontaneity. You really do have to put effort and energy into communicating about what turns you on, what turns you off. And by the way, this is so startling to me, Noel, that I've worked with couples who've been married for 35 years or longer. And believe it or not, many of them have never, ever talked about sex with each other.
No way.
It's really true. It's startling. Yeah, I'm really startled.
Oh my
Or
gosh.
they talk to each other very early on in the relationship. But let's face it, what works for two people early on in a relationship is different over time because our bodies change, our needs change. And if we don't have open communication about what feels good and what doesn't feel so good, or what you want to sort of liven things up a little bit, your relationship will become stale and it will become very, very difficult. I wanted to add one more thing, a tip for the person with higher desire and what he or she can do. So often when the person with higher desire wants to encourage the other spouse to become more sexual, they go out and do things that would please them. So they go buy sexy lingerie or sexy movies or sexy scents, and they give them to their spouse. But the truth is that's not necessarily what turns that person on. What you have to do is tune into your partner's turn-ons, not your own turn-ons. And let's just say if it's, in this case, a guy who has higher desire, maybe what would turn his wife on is if he said to her, you know what, on Saturday morning, I know you've been working really hard. You stay in bed, you sleep, I'm getting up with the kids. I want you to relax. Or go spend a weekend away with your girlfriends. I know that you've really been stressed out. That may be the aphrodisiac, and she'll come home wanting to be with him. So you really have to, in a sense, speak your partner's love language, not your own love language.
Yes. Well, as a husband that has 3 kids with my wife, I would absolutely affirm the whole space to allow her to have that time, right? I mean, there's such... Is learning what is their needs, right? What is their emotional needs, and being able to meet those versus just looking at my own.
Exactly.
So this all sounds great. I'm just thinking about the listener viewer who is sitting here thinking, well, I love this, but the fact is that as much as I've tried to meet halfway or even all the way, my spouse just refuses to participate in this part of our relationship. I want you to address that because I think that's a pretty big and real issue that we're seeing a lot.
Well, at the risk of sounding like I'm going to promote something here,
I want you to promote.
Okay, well, I want to tell you that I did a TEDx talk, and I know that a lot of your viewers are familiar with TEDx talks on the topic of the sex-starved marriage. And, there have been nearly 750,000 views at this point, and I've gotten so many emails. I love what I do, but this is the thing I love most. I've gotten so many emails from people who have said to me, I felt so alone and lonely, and hearing you made me realize I'm not alone, and I actually got my spouse to watch the talk, and for the first time in years, we're going to do something about this.
Wow.
So I'm really excited about that.
Yeah.
And then also along those same lines, the book, The Sex-Starved Marriage, is really written for both people to read together. And, I explain each person's position so that they can have compassion for one another. And I really have a good way of sort of, working my way in there and talking to the person with lower desire who, as I said, controls the sexual relationship and giving that person reasons and motivation to turn things around in the relationship. So there is hope. Do not give up.
Yeah. So, and I love that. I mean, the book, the TED Talk, but I'm just going to come back again. What about that couple who they're saying they're not willing? I've done all of that and they still are unresponsive to this area of our relationship. Is there anything? I mean, is it basically there is no hope, or I mean, what would you say to that person?
Well, you're talking to the psychotic optimist. I just don't think there really is such a thing. I mean, a lot of times, there are a number of things. usually the person with higher desire has been pursuing and pursuing and pursuing. And everyone probably knows that when you pursue someone, you're going to push the other person in the opposite direction. Mm-hmm. So one sort of last-ditch effort that might be tried is to really, as the higher desire spouse, to stop pushing so much, to leave room in the universe for the other partner to take some initiative. That's one thing. The other thing is, so often the person with lower desire says, I'm not going to be physical at all, because that's a complaint that I hear a lot. It's not only that we're not having sex, we're not holding hands, we're not kissing, we're not sitting next to each other on the couch, we're not cuddling in bed, we're not going to bed at the same time. And when I talk to low desire spouses about this, what they say is, I'm afraid that if I do anything physical, kiss him, give him a hug, goodbye in the morning, that it will inevitably lead to his or her wanting this to be turning into sex. So one of the agreements that they can make, for starters, is to be able to touch just affectionately and sensually without it leading to sex. And of course, the very last thing I can say is that it's absolutely essential that if on your own you haven't been able to get through to your spouse, there's professional help out there.
Yes.
We work with people literally all over the world. And we give them suggestions of what they could do differently. Sometimes you can't see the forest for the tree because you're so close to the problem.
Right.
To really discover something perhaps that you haven't tried, but you don't have to give up. There's always something you haven't tried.
I love that. I thank you for responding, because I was just pressing, because I know I've talked to them where they're just feeling so desperate and they feel like they've tried everything.
I know.
And it's almost like at this point, I just can't keep going forward, and it's a really tough place to be.
Well, it is. And I guess the other thing is, sometimes those folks, when they feel that they've tried everything, then they announce that they're getting a divorce. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a step before that, or several steps. And one, as I just told you, they should get some professional help.
Right.
But secondly, they should tell their spouse, if after trying everything, and especially things that I've outlined in the book, because there are many more alternatives than what you and I are talking about right here. They need to tell their spouse, this is so important to me. I feel like I am so starving in this relationship, and I feel so devastated that if something doesn't change, I really am going to need to leave this relationship. Before they actually give up. Because a lot of times people announce that they're getting a divorce when it's too late. And when their spouse then starts to change, which they do, they become more affectionate, more physical, the other spouse will say, that's too little, too late. So really be open and honest with your spouse about how devastating this has been for you, and the steps you're going to take if something doesn't change, not as a threat, not as an ultimatum, but as the truth.
Yes, that's really good. Well, one of the populations that we serve is our military, and in that we've had a chance, and it's been a real privilege and honor to come alongside couples who are wounded, ill, and injured. And yes. Many of them are invisible wounds, so they're dealing with PTSD and TBI and some of those injuries. And I know that you address this in the book about medication and how medication have implications to this area in the relationship. I was just wondering if you could address that. I mean, I know that maybe not necessarily specific to that audience, but just how medication, I think, is becoming more and more commonplace to hear how this is affecting the sex life of couples.
So a lot of people are taking antidepressants, and I'm not sure if that's what you're talking about,
yes.
Noel, but 40, and there's a certain kind of antidepressant called SSRI, and 40% of people who take SSRIs, both for depression and anxiety, by the way, experience sexual side effects, where they have difficulty feeling aroused, they have difficulty getting erections, and difficulty climaxing. And then they think there's something wrong with them, or they think there's something wrong with their spouse when they're experiencing some of these dysfunctions. When the truth is, what they need to do is go back to their doctors and ask, is there an alternative to this medication so that I'm not experiencing some of these sexual difficulties?
Okay. That's very, very helpful.
And by the way, in terms of, people experiencing PTSD or some of the other dysfunctions or disabilities that you just mentioned, there's such great help available for people so that they can feel better and be more present in their relationships.
Yeah. Well, I think we've been kind of more landing on some of the negative consequences of, if this is not working in low desire versus high desire. I want to just jump momentarily kind of to wrap up here to talk about the benefits that you see in couples who have an active sex life. Can we just maybe cover some of those things? I think really at the end of the day, it's about that, putting it in perspective and saying, here's where the hope lies in this type of aspiring to. It's not easy. It's a challenge. We have to communicate. We have to overcome our, conflict. But when we are able to meet at that place of an active sex life, what are the benefits for couples?
Look, sex and touch is a tie that binds. I mean, it is primal for us in terms of a sense of connection, closeness, feeling safe in a relationship. Plus, when it works the right way, having sex with your spouse should be what sets that relationship apart from all other relationships. It is what makes it special and unique. And I have found that, when I go out to a restaurant and I watch couples, I can always tell who's having sex and who isn't having sex, you can just, there seems to be a lightness, a connection,
right.
Smiling, more conversation. And I can always tell the people who are not having sex, it's all missing. It's just missing. So, not everybody's going to feel that sex is a tie that binds for them. But if you happen to be married to someone who feels that way, then taking care of each other, this mutual caretaking that underlies all healthy relationships is something that really, really needs to be in place.
Yeah. You're so right. That's so funny. I've had that thought when I've sat in a restaurant. It's like, wow, I wonder. Yeah. So thanks for actually stating what I was thinking. So what we've been talking
more next time when you go out to a restaurant.
Yeah, exactly. So what we've been talking about is Michelle Weiner Davis' book, The Sex-Starved Marriage, an absolute masterful piece that you've written here. I think just the candor and the honesty, and yet the practical advice. I can't recommend this book enough to our audience. And just so you all know that the book and how to get it's going to be linked right below this video, along with the TED Talk that you mentioned, which is a great talk. I've watched it, and man, that's amazing how many people have viewed it. That will also be linked down below this video, so you can go and look at it and watch that. So, Michelle, I want to say thank you.
Just let me say one more thing.
Yeah.
And because we work a lot with military over the phone in our telephone coaching program, that if really anybody is having a difficult time sexually or otherwise in their relationship and one person's considering getting out, before you take any major steps to make that change, really it would be great to talk to a divorce busting coach because there's solutions. So,
yes.
And thank you so much for having me on. Absolutely. It's been a while since we've talked, and I really appreciate your having me. Oh my gosh,
no, it's a privilege and honor. So thank you. And so on that coaching, they just call you guys directly. Is that right? Because that's a great resource for military.
We have a couple of numbers, and I can give them to you,
okay.
If you'd like afterwards.
Yeah.
There. Yes, and we literally speak to military folks all over the world who are, who have actually said to us, I'm in the front lines here in this part of the world, but nothing is as scary to me as what's happening in my marriage. And we've been really helping those folks out.
Great. Well, again, thank you so much. And until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you for the work that you're doing.
And thanks for the work you're doing as well.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
I always wonder what happens on the way home when couples leave our show after a face-off. With Dr. Phil. When we first met Carolyn on our Marriage Myth-series, she said she thought marrying Peter would be like a lifelong date. I remember that. With hugs and kisses every day. Take a look.
When I met my husband Peter 11 years ago, I thought I was entering a life filled with romance, romance, romance. But now, between juggling our busy schedules and kids, I'm lucky if I get a kiss once a week. When we were dating, Peter was the most romantic, thoughtful man. He made me feel beautiful and desirable. There were rose petals and champagne and weekend getaways to the beach. I crave my husband's attention. I long for him to take me in his arms and hold me. I try not to take it personally, but can't help wondering, is it me? Have I changed? I don't know how much longer I can go on like this.
What did you expect? You said champagne and rose petals, right?
Yes, champagne, rose petals. I don't know. In the beginning, there was so much. There were so many things that we did together and so much time together.
Don't you guys know that life and marriage is not a date? We get this idea of marriage from Hollywood, and we have these unreasonable expectancy sets. We think it's going to be rose petals down the hallway and a rose on the pillow, and that's not it. And that doesn't mean that your relationship has gone bad. When you're falling in love, that's infatuation. And what happens is when people don't have it, they say, well, gosh, I guess something's wrong with our marriage. And so they hop from one relationship to another, looking to capture that high again. But it changes from infatuation to a more comfortable love, a soft place to fall.
Well, Carolyn says she had to a complete turnaround since that show, but her husband needs a thump on the head. Why?
Well, he took it as a get out of romance free card. Peter seemed to think that Dr. Phil was some sort of king of the world and was all on his side, and that now he doesn't have to do absolutely anything. Where I do agree, I was looking for too much. I was looking for what the beginning stages of the romance.
So it's gone too far the other direction.
Oh, yeah. His idea of romance is on Sundays, we're an Italian family. I make gravy and pasta and meatballs, and just spending time together with the family that day is our romantic date. So.
And see, what I hate to burst your bubble here, Peter, but you got to put some effort into this unless you just like masturbating a lot or something. I'm going to tell you. You're kind of sorry, but
where did that come from?
With this get out of romance free card, you're going to deal yourself right out the door, okay? The pendulum, there's a pendulum that swings back. You okay?
Go ahead.
There's a pendulum that swings back and forth. What I'm saying is everybody gets this romantic view like you're supposed to parachute in every night in a tuxedo and say, Bond, Peter Bond. That's fantasy, but, hey, give me some more spaghetti. It is too far the other direction, okay? You've got to find a place in there where you acknowledge and meet her needs. And you've acknowledged that yours were unrealistic.
Yes.
So you've come back to the center.
Like the soap opera version.
Yeah, so like you were over here and he was here, but you moved back to the center. Now he's moved over here.
Yes.
and what we want this to do is we want it to meet in the middle somewhere. You're going to get out of this what you put into it, okay?
I've had, since the last show, I feel you did let me off a little bit, but I think I spent more time at least paying attention to her. I'll admit the romance hasn't been there, but I used to come in, not even say hi to her. So I started at least saying hi to her when I come home from work and spending time watching TV instead of being in the other room.
Okay, Peter, let me introduce
she's looking for champagne and rose petals. How about a hello? Our most watched show of our relationship rescue series was on sexless marriage. Ooh. Here's Dr. Phil telling it like it is to a young mother who said she'll do anything to avoid having sex with her husband.
I think after my first child, I thought, oh, I'm a mother. Moms don't do that. Moms aren't, sexy and...
Okay, so you stopped being a wife and a lover and started being a mom.
Yeah.
Are you aware that you made that conscious decision?
Yes, I did. I made it consciously. I said it to myself. I've made that choice to say, I'm going to raise my kids and be their mom. And then when they're gone, I'll be his wife.
No, you won't. No, you won't. I mean, you won't be his wife when they're gone because you're setting it up so that won't last. You're setting it up, even if you're there, you will be in an emotional divorce because you paralyzed your relationship when your kids were 2 and 3 years old and there's no development over the next years. How do you feel when you reach out to her sexually and you get rejected?
Sometimes I get angry. I don't know what to do. We start arguing and we take it home and it just makes it a big issue.
If you have a good sexual relationship, it's about 10% because you enjoy it and you go on to the other aspects of the relationship. But if you don't, it's 90% because it becomes a big barrier between you and you can
Colors
feel
everything
rejected.
else.
And it does. It puts up a filter where you resent. You start picking at everything. And you start picking at each other and picking at housekeeping and picking at work and picking at how the kids are being handled because you're so frustrated. The quality of a relationship depends on how well it meets the needs of the two people involved.
Right.
And if you're not meeting the needs of your wife, then she's not going to experience this as high quality and come jump in your arms. And it doesn't have anything to do with a rose on her pillow at night. It has to do with how you make her feel about herself, what you contribute to the relationship that says, I'm here, good or bad, up or down. I'm not just your husband in the bedroom. I'm your husband all day long.
In this video, we are going to be talking about the sexless marriage. No fun, right? No. We are Casey and Megan Caston of Marriage 365, and we are a nonprofit dedicated to helping couples connect with a variety of resources.
Obviously, your sex life is a vital part of your relationship. It's a connector. It's a secret language between two lovers. Ooh. And it's interesting because, I mean, sex obviously satisfies a very base biological need, but also it satisfies this intense emotional need for love and belonging. So when sex is good, it's good, right? But there's seems to be some sort of multiplier because when it's bad, it's not just bad, it's really bad. And couples that are in a sexless marriage are in the danger zone. They are lonely spouses and we are driven for connection. So if we can't find it inside a relationship, these are the spouses that are driven to affairs, addictions, they use substances to numb out pain. So it is a real marriage killer. Now I want to talk about a couple barriers that couples experience in a sexless marriage, barriers that keep them from getting it on in the bedroom. The first one is obviously a mismatched hormonal level. So testosterone drives that sexual desire and need. And so if there's just medications that can whack that out, there's life choices and life situations, stresses.
But sometimes it's just one spouse has a high sex drive.
That's right.
And one spouse has a low sex drive.
Right.
So that's just sometimes what it is.
It is.
Yeah.
So unresolved conflict is a huge barrier that we encounter.
Huge barrier.
Huge. Because it's the unresolved issues outside the bedroom that keep couples from getting it on inside the bedroom. Anger, resentment, unforgiveness. There's this tension that couples have. And so, you know, sex is obviously this release. It's vulnerable, but you can't do that when you're so closed up and tight.
When you're resentful. And I would say too, for women, we need to feel that emotional connection in order to have great sex and to be willing to have it and wanting to have it. So yeah, if there's unforgiveness and unresolved issues, we typically put up a wall for sure. Another really common barrier, you guys, that we're seeing more and more is stress. Oof. Stress, we say, is the #1 libido killer. We are too busy, too maxed out with our schedules. We have too much on our plate. We don't tell people no. We have no boundaries and no limits. And because of that, we are stressed. Not to mention that many people work way more than 40 hours a week. And I'm talking 70, 80, 90 hours a week. And that's just gonna cause stress.
And by the end of the day, they're just so tired. They're like, I can't even think about having sex.
Absolutely. Another thing kind of on the same lines as stress would be just not making it a priority. That you've made your hobbies, your friends, your kids, your job, you know, your career, whatever that is, a larger priority than taking time to have sex. And let's be honest, it takes time to have sex. It takes energy and it takes time. It's a really good workout, actually.
Yeah.
But, you know, sure, sometimes it's, you know, quickies are great. But genuinely speaking, if you want to have a great sex life, you're going to have to spend 10, 15, 20, sometimes 30 minutes on foreplay and showering and all of that good stuff.
But who has time for that?
And if you're maxed out with your schedule and you're not making your sex life a priority, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about ED. It is not on the rise, but it is.
What is ED, babe, for those people that don't know?
Erectile dysfunction.
Okay.
We are hearing from more and more couples that are experiencing erectile dysfunction, and there is a very distinct correlation and relationship between porn usage and erectile dysfunction. There's a lot of reasons why ED could impact a relationship, but porn usage, being that it's so prevalent now in our society, that is becoming a big, huge barrier in the bedroom. And we can go, there's a huge amount of conversation around that, of what porn does, setting up the fantasy that cannot be actualized in real life.
Yeah, we actually have an entire webcast that you can find on our site on the effects that pornography has. But erectile dysfunction, it's on the rise. It's genuinely, it's becoming more common, and it's, you know, men are watching pornography 1, 2, 3 times a day. So of course they can't get it up for their wife.
Correct.
So
another barrier is a hyper-religious upbringing. Okay, so if you've been raised in a church environment that has shamed the topic of sex, saying that, you know, don't do it, it's bad, it's naughty, you can't do it until you're married. You hear about the sexually active high school students and they're kind of, you know, ushered out the back, they're shamed. That can be a very bad scripting, because all of a sudden one day it's bad, and then once you say I do, all of a sudden it's good. That's a huge barrier to overcome.
Absolutely.
Okay?
And our last barrier would be childbirth and parenting.
Oh, parenting.
So for those of you who have kids, let's all take a deep breath. Young kids, right? Not only, of course, is your body healing after you have a baby, for us ladies, but oftentimes your newborn sleeps in bed with you, right in between mom and dad. You know, you're barely getting sleep. Kids require so much time and energy, and they're very demanding. Their schedules are demanding, and so you're just physically exhausted, mentally exhausted, and oftentimes that's a massive barrier.
I'm exhausted just talking about it.
I know, right? Now, luckily, the childbirth and the parenting is just a season, and we want to invite you guys to actually watch our entire webcast on the sexless marriage, where we give you a list of over 20 different barriers, and then we don't just leave you there, because we're very practical. We want to give you the tools. We give you 4 steps to take to kind of move from a sexless marriage to a thriving, healthy sex life. Now, we would define a sexless marriage as having sex 5 times or less a year. But that's our definition.
Yeah.
And genuinely, you could be having sex with your spouse once, maybe even twice a month, but you want it more and you feel like you're in a sexless marriage. So this webcast genuinely is for everybody. We invite you to watch it. With the webcast comes couples connecting questions, where we give you the questions to have an open and honest and vulnerable conversation with your spouse, so that you can have a great sex life.
But like you said, we also give you the action plans. We don't want to just overwhelm you with a bunch of information. We want to tell you exactly what you need to do next, so that you can get your marriage back on track. Go check it out. Now, we offer a free 7-day trial. Kick the tires, see if it works for you. Visit www.nakedconversations.org and start your free trial today.
Thanks, guys.